Good evening and welcome to tonight's Committee of the Whole meeting for November 9th, 2021. Clerk will call the roll, please.
Odekirk.
Present.
Hanson.
Present.
Gilson.
Here.
Hildebrand.
Here.
Wilson.
Here.
Shilsky.
Here.
Nelson.
Here.
Let the record show we have a quorum. Next is the approval of the minutes from the last Committee of the Whole, May 11th, 2021. Chair will entertain a motion.
Motion to approve.
We have a first and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. Moving on to item 3, 2022 budget discussion. We have our interim director, Kathy Austin, and utility manager here tonight Kim Ross to give us a idea of what we have for our budget numbers for 2022. So with that.
Thank you, Mayor. So I hope everyone brought their binder. So I thought what we would do kind of is not a complete page turn, but kind of just do more of a kind of a page turner tonight. Between Kim and I, we'll call out some kind of key important pieces, and then I'll kind of break at different points and kind of have more of an open dialogue. If you guys had questions along the way, we can answer those, and then so we'll go from there. So kind of starting, I guess on the kind of page 19. So kind of the first 19 pages are kind of just the city policies. So then page 19, I just wanted to kind of show the graphical of what the tax levy, right? So the tax levy is going to be 59% of the revenue, and that's assuming that 100,000 increase of the tax levy. So again, most of our revenue is tax levy based. We do have other sources, but the majority is that tax levy. So then if we want to turn, kind of another big part of our revenue is the utility pilot. So that's payment in lieu of taxes. So the utility doesn't pay the city taxes. They do the pilot on the revenue. So my understanding of it is very 1,000-foot level as they improve and make improvements within the city limits. So this is not the whole territory, but city limits. Their equity grows, and then based on what our tax mill rate is, they pay the city proportional. So would you like to give an overview on the pilot program?
Sure. I mean, I'll just add on what you said. So essentially, each year we have different capital projects at the utility, and it's very important at the utility to continue to have capital because that's really how we have a rate of return, and that's how we keep our rates stable, and we earn on that. So the utility will actually have a little bit of a workshop after the first of the year, after we get through some of the crunch time, to kind of talk through that. So each year, if we were to spend $1 million in the city on capital projects, it would increase our pilot payment to you about $14,500, and that's based on the current mill rates. So it's the mill rate of the city plus the school district is what we're paying on. And it's also, it's not the depreciated value of the assets, it's the total value of the asset. So that's always been a little bit confusing for me at first to get a hold of, but that is how it works. Since we are a larger utility and we have rural areas, sometimes it's difficult at the beginning of the year to know an estimate on how much capital is going to be in the city versus the rural territory. So sometimes the split is a little bit difficult because when Baker Tilly came in this last year, they actually switched us to be timing-wise the same as the city. So the utility would expense before the pilot based on actual information that we had, and then we would pay the city the following year. Baker Tilly matched us up now, so when we take the expense of the utility, we match, and now you take the revenue at the city. So that's a new step this year. So we have a little bit of trickery going on to see if we can figure this out and create some new reports and analysis to help us figure out what that number is. But do you have any questions on how it's calculated? Okay.
Good.
On page 24 and 25, those pages look a little bit different than in the prior years too, is they're more itemized out revenues instead of just, and that's just to help us line up with all of our audits and federal reporting that we have to do, or state reportings that we have to do. So it's all there, it just will look a little bit different. The categories are the same because those are all mandated, but it's just, there's probably a lot more lines this time than there had been in the past. So then when you look, so overall, our total revenue for 2022 is projected to be $7,655,340. Okay.
I am glad to see, Director Austin, that you got the actual 18, 19, and 20 for comparison's sake in the chart. I think that's very helpful to see where we've been kind of in a historical, even though it's recent, but that gives us a little comparison to look back at the same time that we're looking forward. So I think that's good.
And one thing to note, so in 2020, obviously it's asterisk, right? And our revenues were down in 2020 due to COVID. And we'll touch base on it a little bit later. There is a sheet that kind of shows our COVID expenses in here on page 32. And so COVID expenses are not going to show up in our expenses for 2020. So as you look and compare year to year, we kind of took them out just so that we had more of a true actual 2020. And the same thing with the revenue. So any revenue we got COVID related is not shown in our 2020. We kind of kept it as its own COVID pot of money because it was a specialized case. So everything COVID related, revenue and expenses, is going to kind of be summarized on page 32 and not part of any other totals throughout the document.
Good.
So kind of now going into kind of just the overall expenditures of the city. So page 26, kind of just like historical years, the most of the expenses will be out of the police department at 27.8%. Public Works is going to be expensing about 18.1% of the budget. And one thing you will note compared to the pie chart on the backside is the capital projects. So kind of into 2020, as we've talked in the past, we're looking at capital projects being about just under 12% compared to almost 15% the year before. Page 29 and page 30 are going to look at where our mill rate will be. So we did get the calculations from the state on our assessment ratio. So that looks at our assessed values throughout the city compared to the equalized value, kind of fair market. And with the market kind of the way it is, one would expect that we kind of decreased again. So last year we were at kind of 0.89%. Now we're down to 0.84%. So when we look at what the citizens in the tax roll would see is going to be paid on page 30. So with the 100,000 in there, our mill rate will go up to $7.21 compared to $7.06 last year. So like on a $200,000 home, right? So if your home is $200,000, you're going to be going up about 2.25%. So that's $31.69. So that's kind of just for comparable. Page 31 will kind of show you the assessment ratio trend, which is one of it's kind of the main reason why we're doing our reassessment of our city, to try to get that value back up to 1, right? Because you would see on kind of page 29, if our equalized and our assessed values were more in line, right, we wouldn't see as much of an increase in the assessed mill rate, right? So that's kind of the difference between the two. And then, as I mentioned before, page 32 is kind of just the COVID recap page. So I'll take any questions you have on kind of the beginning information before we roll into kind of more of the departmental. Any questions?
Good.
So we'll kind of just do page turners. Some are won't have much information. So we want to go to page 37. Kind of just the mayor and the common council budget. Things pretty much stayed status quo. You look at 2020 actuals in the common council budget. That was high because of our payments to HR Gov. So that's kind of what that why that was so much higher compared to years prior. But with 2022, we're kind of back down to kind of like the normal historic numbers. Page 38 under municipal court, their operational budget besides wages, I'm gonna kind of just say, right, wages are increasing across the board, but otherwise there's nothing substantial in municipal court. Turning to page 41 for the clerk, treasurer, and elections. The main pieces there were wages up in clerk, treasurer, and then in elections, just because we have 4 elections versus 2 elections, that budget fluctuates depending upon which election cycles we're in. With postage going up and more absentee ballots being mailed out, that's kind of why the big increase on the election side of things. And stop me after any section, and because it'll just be easier to, if you guys have questions at any particular point. On page 43, city administration and utilities manager. Again, pretty much everything stays status quo. 2020 actual is just low due to when Administrator Jurgis left. So that's kind of why that one's lower. On page 45, kind of that's going to be our contracted services. So just on the city attorney side, just the last couple years have been a little bit higher, so we did bump that up just for Crystal's needs. The assessor, so we'll see in 2022 the contracted service that increased substantially for the reevaluation, and then we'll pay the entire thing in 2022 as per our original contract with them. And then down to building and zoning administration. So one thing that I did find out last week is that Carson Gosh, so we contract our zoning administration out with the county. Carson is resigning from the county, which means that we are losing our zoning administrator. So I have to work with the county yet. I mean, they're going to have to fill a role, make sure that they'd be qualified to do what we would need them to do. So our contract with the county is a little bit on hold. In the interim, Pete Shireman is willing to step back in and help us on the zoning side of things in this interim position for at least a few months.
I have a question back on the
Sure.
assessor.
Yes.
How long will the assessment take? Will it be done in 2022, or will it go to 2023, or how does that work?
My understanding, and I haven't had a huge discussion with them, is that they actually started some of the legwork this year, but we're not paying them anything this year. They're just kind of starting to do the initial research. And my understanding is that it would be done for next year, is my understanding.
Thank you.
I believe it was mentioned about September as the target date, if I remember correctly. So it would be finished for the year end.
Mm-hmm. On page 46 is kind of like the debt service transfers, our capital fund transfers, kind of the I can't even say that word right now, miscellaneous items. So the contingency fund, that's status quo. That's part of our policy to have contingencies in the operational budget for 10% or 1% of our overall budget. The professional fees, that's going to be our Baker Tilly audit. And then the maintenance here at City Hall. So the debt service transfer you'll see is substantially lower. So last year our payment was $463,000. We're going to transfer over to the debt service fund $370,000. And then again, I think I mentioned that the last time is we have a balance in the debt service account right now because of our refinancing. So to help offset all of our other revenues or all of our other expenses, we'll be able to use kind of that surplus in that account to balance. So our debt service payment is still over $400,000, but we just have to transfer over less. And then the same thing with that capital fund transfer. And we'll talk more about capital when we get kind of on that back side of things. On page 47, our employment benefits, a lot of those items have now been moved to kind of the department which they reside in. So if they have, there's still a little bit of the insurance, the risk insurance that's staying kind of in this overall one. That's more like the administrative insurances. But if it's a police department risk and all their insurances are now moved into, so you have true what your police department is costing, right? So that kind of got moved over. And again, the same thing with the health insurance. And then for everything else kind of on this page is kind of staying status quo, the little cost we have at the cemetery. And then under conservation and development, so the city puts $7,500 into the RDA, so that's that amount. And then the room tax commission, that's another change. So there's a lot more committed funds in this document than in the years past too. So when we get the room tax, it's not really an expense from the city, right? So we still see our revenue that we get, but all the other expenses, the payment to the chamber is actually a room tax commission payment. It's not really a city payment. So those are kind of some of the changes that occurred. On page 51, we're kind of on to the IT budget. And that's over the course of the year over the course of the years have increased. That's just due to this budget is paying for all the software maintenance and agreements that we have now, and it's not in Public Works doesn't have GIS, and the clerk's office doesn't have theirs anymore. It's all residing in this IT budget so that we know where the costs are, he's paying for them, and so that's where they're housing now. So there's probably still some areas that we can clean up in the future, to make sure that we're still not a department that isn't over budgeting, but most of them have been identified and have been moved over into this IT budget. On page 54, police department. I think besides wages and gas and oil, again, their budget is staying pretty status quo. And this budget does not have the 17th officer in it. So I know that there were some discussions about getting the grant, maybe for a partial year, but the way the budget currently sits, there is no wages in for a 17th officer. Not to say we can't get one mid-year and we have contingency funds or something like that, that's still all a possibility, but the way the dollar showed it, that's not in there at this time.
Sure. Go ahead, John.
Where are we at with the 17th officer? Is the time to ask that or not the time to ask that?
I cannot answer that for you at this time.
It wasn't included in the finance and personnel budget. We had the discussion with Chris. I think it was actually twice, if I remember right. And then, of course, he retired and went on to a new endeavor. never did get a final presentation from any of Chris's recommendations. So it was, for lack of a better word, kind of like, okay, then we'll follow up next year. Did you have any, Leah, other discussions with Chris on his way out that he talked any further on that?
I did not. I wasn't aware of the 17th officer being in the budget until later on, so I wasn't able to follow up with Chris on anything, but part of my understanding as well, I mean, I could be wrong, but they had to file the grant, which would first be something to look at for next year.
Yeah, and it was really contingent on the grant, if possible, but that didn't materialize. And unfortunately, we haven't been very successful in getting grants because the city is simply, to be honest, we're too healthy, which is a nice thing, but when it comes to grants, we're so down low on the totem pole that we don't end up getting anything a lot of times. So
we applied for the grant and didn't get it?
no,
No, we have
we
not.
didn't apply for it.
That I know we have not applied for a grant yet.
No.
Yeah. I think it was just left for more discussion. Later discussion.
Right, yeah.
It wasn't fully
It
discussed.
never
It
got.
wasn't fully discussed yet.
It never got fully presented other than the discussion. And it was based on what are our chances for the grant. So it was a combination of things, and then, of course, Chris retired, and, okay, we'll roll it forward, and the information is still there, is probably the best way to say that.
And then on page 60 will be the fire department. And again, I don't, not much in their budget has changed. This does include the additional wages though. So they are seeing $1 increase for each of their hourly wages versus just the 2.75%. So this budget does include that additional increase.
On all wages.
So the fire department is above and a little bit above and beyond.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in the full-time equivalent wage structure, the 2.75
It's
is
across the
there.
board. Yes,
Yep.
correct. Yep, yep. And I do know that the new fire chief has met with the town too, and he wants to be more involved to make sure that we're all in the same alignment for future needs for both of the departments, but that's ongoing.
The wage increase for the volunteer firemen was $1,
Correct, yeah.
which was beyond the 2.75%, but when you're down at $7 going to $8 isn't much of a change. So we still appreciate their volunteer work.
On page 61, under kind of the miscellaneous public safety, not much has changed there. Weights and measures is a payment that we pay to the state, but we also get the revenue in from the larger industries. And then civil defense, that's going to be police department. And then they're just a little bit for animal control. Weed cutting is eliminated because it's really a pass-through expense. If someone, if we have to go and cut someone's yard, we're just going to bill them and it's just a pass-through. So starting with public works, kind of on page 64 is the management. So that's purely more just with the wages and the alcohol testing that we have to do to our, for the employees. Page 65 is,
How come that is going down $7,000?
So that is that, so when Matt Magel's hours are looked at, he gets allocated out based on where the labor pool is working. And so his time will go towards the stormwater utility and kind of those areas. So it's just based on kind of where the true hours of the department is working versus staying fully in this budget.
This was also the increase for the swimming, or is that not in this area?
That, for the lifeguards, you're saying?
Lifeguard, yes.
Yeah, that's later. That's in the parks
I
budget.
was wondering why that went down.
Yep, yep. On page 65 is going to be the public works budget. Now I'll have to kind of move faster. I saw Crystal come in. So on page 65 is the public works. Again, the major ones here are the labor and the gas and oil. So on the labor side of things, a few years ago, when the utility meter readers retired, right, they borrowed an employee from the DPW. So probably about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a huge cost savings in labor on the city side because that transferred all to the utility. Well, now we don't need that meter reader at the utility anymore, so that position needs to be funded again in the city budget. So that's kind of why it's a larger increase there. On to library, really her budget kind of stayed pretty status quo, seeing a little bit less in revenue, but overall everything else is pretty staying status quo. On page 70 is the parks budget, and that's where you'll see the lifeguard wages. So we haven't been expensing that whole 120 like we had in the past, and it'll be a little bit more to pay the lifeguards their increase. So that's kind of our expenditures in a nutshell. Any questions?
No debts?
No new debt. So kind of the next pages are going to be kind of just our fund balances. So if we spend, I think, a little bit of time on the capital page, page 80. So if you look on that sheet at the bottom, kind of at the year end 2021, our capital fund balance is projected to be $896,893. So that's where we're projecting the end of this year to fall. So when I was looking at the capital budget for 2022, I gave you guys the summary of the projects that were kind of eliminated out. I looked at the amount that we're putting into the capital, and I stayed below that, right? So we're not increasing our fund balance a lot by the end of the year, but we're not going to use any of the reserve. So that's kind of what this is showing. So if you're comfortable with that, we'll continue. Otherwise, more cuts in the capital are going to have to be made. If we're not comfortable with at the end of 2022, the fund balance would be about $900,000. So if we want that to be higher, we need to cut more projects.
Alderman Hanson?
The $100,000, prior to this meeting, it was 18,000, was it, or was it 100,000 before? But that's included in to keep these projects.
Mm-hmm.
So if we eliminate that 100,000, these projects would be reduced.
Yep.
Someplace else in the budget.
Right. So if you don't want to increase the tax levy, the $100,000, we'd have to cut $100,000 out of the capital. If also similarly, if you wanted a higher capital reserve at the end of 2022, and you wanted that $100,000 to be used solely to bring up that reserve, you're still going to have to cut $100,000 out of your capital, more than we've already cut. So I did provide kind of just a summary of the projects that were cut out. Did anyone have questions on any of those, or?
It was helpful.
Okay. And then if we probably just have 5 more minutes, and then we probably need to move on. But on the utility side of the budget, so now kind of pages 92 through right here. Let's see even here.
109.
Yeah, 109-ish. Yep, 10. So on the electrical side, again, on the water side, it does assume the 3% increase come the first of the year. And then it also the last 3 years, or 2 years, 2 full years, when the meter reader was done doing his reads, he helped with the AMI implementation. So we've been working with a 4-man water crew the last 2 years in the water department. So this budget is also kind of it's keeping that guy in the water department, but in a way adding a 4th guy full-time in the water department, keeping that kind of status quo. And we're getting more regulations on lead and copper rule and a lot of more implementation and testing that needs to be done. So the budget does include, and I don't know if it's been mentioned previously, but keeping a 4-man crew in the water department. Other than that, is there other, and I know Alderman Nelson the last time, kind of on the ops plant, that went up a lot, and now it went back down, and that was all labor pool. And so what we redid with and how it had been shown in previous years, the labor is distributed out where they're working. So the same thing with the water and electric. It's not like DPW where there's one labor line item based on where they've been working historically based on their time cards. It's allocated into those dollar amounts. And so that's why that's a big difference compared to what it was a couple weeks ago. Okay.
How is that working out, put into the areas? Is it more bookwork, or is it, if your person does the line work compared to doing the sewer, they're charged accordingly to that budget? Is that pretty good flow of things?
Yeah, our business system has something called timekeeping, so they all have their own timesheets for kind of what they're doing. So even if you have a person that's never done something before, you can give them a code, so that when Leah processes payroll, it's a 3-digit code, so it's not a lot of extra work or anything, but it goes then all to the right general ledger accounts. And there's also projects involved where you can track costs on a capital project or something like that. So it's not so bad. And then we also can set up, like Kathy was talking earlier about Matt's time as supervisor of DPW following where the hours are going. That's an overhead rate that's applied as the hours go. And so is health insurance, and so is like if they have vacation time and things like that. Yeah.
So I think just the last thing, before we move on, that I just want to touch base on a little bit, in the utility capital, one project that was kind of on the electric side of things. So, kind of on one of the last 2 big pages on the utility electric. So we did the construction of sub 6 instead of the $750,000 for next year, because we won't really be ready. That was reduced down to $250,000. But then I did add in to at least start the shed project. Sorry, way at the end of the last group. So the last group of 11 by 17 sheets, the second to last page. So the storage shed, the new quote for that came in at around $1 million. So I want to say when Administrator Jurgis was getting the quotes, it was kind of more just for the building, and that was coming in around $250,000, $275,000. That just the building price now is $460,000 or $438,000. And so what I have in here is about $300,000 for next year. We can do the prep work, the grading work. There's some fill that's needed. You can let that settle for the kind of a freeze thaw cycle. And then we can also watch building trends, right? So if the building material is actually coming down, we could bid out the project, use some of our cash reserves. Otherwise, we could push it off. And at the very least, we could have it in we could move all the equipment into a fenced-in area, right? So at the very least, we could just do that to have it as more protected in a fenced-in area. So that would at least be kind of that strategy. Okay, so that's kind of just different compared to what we've talked about this. Other than that, does anyone have any questions? Because I think we should move on.
Thank you, Director Austin. Does anybody have any questions of Director Austin or our utility manager, Kim Ross? I think that you've done a lot of work in a short time, and it's very appreciated. The utility is, of course, our biggest department, being 38 million or whatever it is, and about 80% or more of that is purchase of electricity. So there's not a whole lot of wiggle room because we're buying through our WPPI partner. But nonetheless, it is a big part of the city, and it has its own budget, but it does affect our overall picture. So it's nice to see the combined reporting. I think that that is a big improvement, and I know it was a lot of work to do that as well, but I think that'll help us down the road. So thank you for everything. Any other questions at all on the budget? We will, of course, have the public hearing in 2 weeks, and the next item on the agenda, the chair will entertain a motion to go into closed session pursuant to Wisconsin Statute 19.85(1)(e), deliberating or negotiating the purchasing of public properties, the investing of public funds, or conducting other specified public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require a closed session, and Wisconsin Statute 19.85(1)(g), conferring with legal counsel for the governmental body who is rendering oral or written advice concerning strategy to be adopted by the body with respect to litigation in which it is or is likely to become involved, the severance agreement of former city administrator, utility manager.
And we'll be going to closed session.
Second, Alderman Hanson.
We have a first